to Haunted Talks, the official podcast of The Haunted Walk, offering thematic walking tours and paranormal adventures in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, Ontario. My name is Jim Dean. I am the creative director, and I really appreciate you joining us for today's show. The next stop on our tour of the best ghost tour companies in the world takes us to St. John's, the picturesque capital of Newfoundland and Labrador. Now, the folks on Canada's East Coast have a well-earned reputation for being some of the nicest and most hospitable people in the country. But they also love a good ghost story. And today, we'll be chatting with legendary storyteller and proprietor of the Haunted Hike, Dale Jarvis. But before we get to that, it's hard to believe, but our Halloween season launches 1 week from today on Friday, September 28th, running through to November 3rd. Time slots are starting to sell out, and I want to make sure you can get in there and get some of the best tickets available. We have a whole slew of paranormal adventures going on in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, and there is no better time of year to join us. A couple of things I do want to draw your attention to. If you're planning to join us for our seance at Black Creek, those tickets are going exceptionally fast, and I would suggest buying them as soon as possible, as we do expect to sell out. It's only a question of when, and we're not that far away. If you're looking for the most terrifying, frightening, soul-shaking Halloween experience possible, and you are anywhere close to Toronto, you need to check this out. It is one of the craziest things we have ever done. Also wanted to remind you that this Saturday and next are our final two runnings of our Haunted Walk experience at the Mackenzie King Estate in Gatineau Park. And it is a fantastic little jaunt out to the country with the leaves changing color. It's just a beautiful time to visit, and certainly Mackenzie King is one of our most fascinating prime ministers. Just the other day, I posted a video on our Facebook page where we explain why he chose to name 3 of his dogs Pat. Now, if you're an animal lover at all, that is a must-watch. Have the Kleenex ready. It's a bit of a tearjerker. And actually, I will be at the Mackenzie King Estate myself this Saturday night, the 22nd. So if you are coming up for a tour, please be sure to say hello. I would love to chat with you. Information about our seance at Black Creek or our Haunted Walk experience at the Mackenzie King Estate and all of our other Halloween shenanigans can be found on our website, which is hauntedwalk.com. We'd love to connect with you as well on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, all 3 at Haunted Walk. Finally, be sure to subscribe to the show so you know when the new episodes are coming out. And if you have a moment or two to write us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to us, it would be certainly greatly appreciated. All right, friends, I hope you enjoyed our ferry ride over to St. John's. Please gather up your belongings. I see Dale waiting for us just down the pier there. Let's all go on the Haunted Hike.
My name is Dale Jarvis, and I am the proprietor of the St. John's Haunted Hike in St. John's, Newfoundland. I always had an interest in stories and storytelling. I loved reading spooky stories when I was a kid, and I never really thought of it as a possible job. And a couple of things happened. I met some really great Canadian storytellers, and they kind of introduced me to the world of storytelling generally. But then in 1997, early in the year of 1997, I was in the city of York in England, and I went on a ghost tour through the old medieval city of York. It was led by this figure dressed all in black, telling these amazing stories. And I thought I should go back to St. John's and do that there. So I came back. pulled together a costume, did some research, and started it up, not really knowing a lot about how to run a haunted business, but that was the very first year, and 21 years later, I'm still telling ghost stories in St. John's.
What makes St. John's a great haunted city to give ghost tours in?
St. John's is the capital city for the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. We're on this island way out in the middle of the North Atlantic. We're actually 2 time zones east of Ontario and the eastern seaboard of the United States. And it has a really fascinating and very old history compared to other parts of North America. It is the newest part of Canada, in a way. We joined into Confederation with Canada in 1949, but it was one of the very first discovered and settled places in North America, settled by Europeans. The Vikings were here around 1000 AD, and then the Europeans started arriving in the late 1400s, 1497. There was an indigenous population here, of course, but we have this long history, largely associated with the cod fishery. So a lot of fishing communities, and communities here were very isolated. So older traditions, older speech patterns, great old European stories, Irish and West Country English superstitions persisted here in a way that maybe they didn't in other parts of North America. So many of the smaller communities didn't get electricity until the 1960s, and that preserved a lot of these old stories. St. John's is a beautiful harbor city, great wooden architecture all through the downtown core, great Gothic revival stone cathedral in the middle of the city where we start the haunted hike. It's often wreathed in fog, and so it has this great history of folklore and superstitions, and then just an incredibly cool, ghostly atmosphere. It's a perfect place for telling ghost stories.
What makes the haunted hike unique compared to other ghost tours?
We actually run a couple different types of walking tours. The longest running one is the haunted hike itself. We do 2 different downtown walking tours, and from the very earliest days of me doing it, I wanted it to be very performative. So the tour is done in character, as my personal character is the very Reverend Thomas Wickham Jarvis, Esquire, who is kind of a spooky, larger-than-life clergyman who leads this tour. I love that kind of high Victorian, grandiloquent style. Very much in that vein of Edgar Allan Poe or H.P. Lovecraft. I love fancy, kind of Victorian-sounding language. So it very much is done in character and done with, some dark humor. It's not a tour that focuses completely on horror. I work a lot of history and a fair bit of humor into it as well. But it's fairly dry humor. We don't play it for laughs. So there is a certain style that has evolved with our tour. And our different guides, they all have different characters that they portray in the tour. We have another program that we also run called the Ghosts of Signal Hill program, which we run in partnership with Parks Canada. That takes place on Signal Hill, which is at the entrance to the harbor, the site of the last land battle between the French and the English on North American soil in 1762. That particular tour is done in an actual historical character, so a character that is actually based on historical documents. So that is a character come to life, whereas with the walking tour, they're very much our own personalities, our own characters that we've created from scratch.
As we get closer to Halloween, it's a time of year where everyone is sharing ghost stories with each other. As an expert, is there one tip you could provide our listeners with if they're sharing ghost stories with their friends and family?
I love ghost stories that are a little unusual, a little strange. I always am intrigued by stories that are a little out of the ordinary. Sometimes I find with Newfoundland ghost stories, there's a certain repetition to stories. So when I'm looking for a good story to tell on the haunted hike, I hear a lot of people who will say, that house is haunted and there's the ghost of a lady in white who drifts down the stairs. And I'm sure that if you were in that space in that moment, that would be a frightening or an intriguing thing, but there's really not a good story behind it. So I'm always looking for the stories behind the apparitions. I like the stories that are human in some way, even though they are ghostly stories. I like those stories that are strange and that have a very local, real flavor to them. So I think if you are developing a story or telling a story, find the background to the story and work in some of those local details. I really like historical stories. That's my personal preference. So the stories that appeal to me are stories that transport me to a different time.
Is there a favorite story you have from your tours that you could share with us?
One of my favorite stories is a story about a house that no longer exists, but it was a fairly well-known story in the kind of the Edwardian period in St. John's. And it involved a man by the name of Samuel Pettiham, who rented a small house. And the story itself dates back to the 1700s, but it was written down in the early 20th century. And the story goes that this man had rented a house and became aware of strange things happening in the building. The latch to the back door would rise into the air and then stop and then sink back down. At first he thought it was local youngsters out to frighten him, but this kind of strangeness repeated time after time, and he could never find anything to account for it. He had a housekeeper who would come in during the day to cook and clean, but she refused to spend a night in the house. As legend is told, the gentleman had been attending a dinner party in the west end of St. John's, and as it was late, his host offered to drive him home, hitching up a horse and carriage. The horse drove up what today is New Gower Street in downtown St. John's. It came up to a street called Queen's Road. And as it came to the little laneway that led to this gentleman's house, the horse stopped, and it refused to budge an inch further forward, even when it felt the sting of the owner's whip. And at this, Pettiham volunteered to walk the rest of the distance. The laneway was dark and overgrown with trees, but ahead of him he could see a glowing light, and thinking it to be a lamp or a lantern of some sort carried by a fellow human being, he quickened his step to catch up with the figure responsible. The figure stood still for a moment and then slowly turned to face Pettiham. Pettiham took one look at the vision and then turned and fled in absolute horror, for the figure he had seen was that of a man, a tall man, a man completely missing his head just above the shoulders. Pettiham raced back along the road. He came to a boarding house and he begged for shelter for the evening. And after he calmed down, he gave a clear version of the night's events and then was told a most miraculous tale. It seems that the house that he had rented had once been the property of a beautiful young lady, dwelt in that very same premises, and she had been the companion of a seafaring captain who had plied his trade between England and Newfoundland. And while the captain was in St. John's, he and the lady were said to be inseparable. However, while the captain was away at sea, the lady showered her affection on a local man, and this second man, jealous of the attentions paid to the captain, was determined to do away with his competition. And late one night, just after the captain had said good night to his lady and had stepped back onto the narrow pathway, the jealous lover leapt forward and with an exceptionally sharp sword severed the captain's head from his body. The culprit was never brought to justice, although all signs of guilt seemed to point in his direction, and the soul of the captain, it is rumored, still haunts the site of his grisly decapitation, forever in search of his unpunished murderer.
That's a good decapitation story.
You can't go wrong with a good decapitation story, no.
I particularly like the extremely sharp sword. Final question for you, Dale. If our listeners are interested in finding out more information about the haunted hike, where's the best place for them to go to get the details?
If people want more information about the St. John's Haunted Hike, you can find us online at hauntedhike.com. The information for the different tours and the special events that we have is there. And if you're looking to kind of follow some of the writing and the research that I'm doing on local phenomena and local historical ghost stories, you can also go to the blog that I run called NL Unexplained, nlunexplained.ca, or you can just go to dalejarvis.ca and it'll pop up there as well.
A big thank you to Dale Jarvis and all our friends at The Haunted Hike for joining us. I really enjoyed the opportunity to chat with him and hear him tell one of his iconic stories. Information about our tours, including our Halloween season, can be found on our website, which is hauntedwalk.com. If you're enjoying the content on the podcast episodes, I'd highly encourage you to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, all at Haunted Walk. Thank you to the amazing Haunted Talks team, including Jillian Walkerchuk, our expert guest wrangler, Michelle Dennis, our intrepid audio editor, and to Kevin MacLeod at Incompetech.com for the additional music. I hope to see some of you this weekend for the Haunted Walk experience at the Mackenzie King Estate in Gatineau Park. Until we meet again next week, sweet dreams.